This is Kimberly Reuter, business advisor and supply chain expert, and welcome to my podcast, The Morning Mood. As I was planning for this podcast yesterday, thinking about what I wanted to talk about, at first I was like, we need to talk about some supply chain stuff. We haven't talked about supply chain in a while. Excuse me as I take a sip of coffee. It's a bit early here. I was inspired early. And I haven't talked about supply chain in a while, and it is a supply chain podcast, and I should talk about supply chain. And then I stopped myself because part of this whole process of doing this podcast, and I don't know if I shared this with you guys, and maybe I should do an episode on this. In fact, I've been trying to make notes on ideas because they come to me and then I forget, is the whole reason I started this podcast was, one, there was like this pull to do it. My life coach, Alicia, always talks about when you have that feeling of something is unacceptable for you not to try it, you have to do it because that is the universe telling you that this is what's right for you. So when I started this podcast, I had this pull to start this podcast, and then I had this idea of what I wanted to be. And I think I told you guys I've been trying to do it for 5 years. And part of why this podcast is different and has gone further than other podcasts. Can you hear my clock? Can you hear that? I collect clocks. I don't know if you guys know that. We'll talk about that another time. Anyway, that's my grandfather's wedding clock. It's the clock I learned to take care of clocks on, and I still have it today. And I keep it running. Anyway, so when I started the podcast, I was like, hey, just keep it open. Let it happen. Throw it out there. What sticks, what doesn't. Test and learn. Fail fast, right? And so whenever I feel myself saying, hey, you should talk about supply chain or you should do this, I stop myself and I go, wait a minute. There are no shoulds with this podcast. This podcast is called The Morning Mood because it's how the hell do I feel like in the morning and what's on my mind? So that's what, I was thinking about supply chain and I said, no, we're not going to do that. And then I said, there's this thing I've been wanting to talk about. It's disappointment. And handling disappointment. And that's been on my mind a little bit too. But when I woke up this morning, what was screaming in my head was conflict. And this is not a topic that is on my list of topics that I keep, my list of ideas. This is not something I ever thought that I would talk about, conflict. But my good friend Tiana and I were recording our podcast yesterday, and you were going to talk to her. You probably will have already heard from her by now. And she and I are working on a fantastic series. We're super excited about it. And during that conversation, conflict came up. And working through conflict and working in high conflict environments. And if you had met Tiana and I, either separately or together, on the other end of a problem that you caused or being caught in a lie, you would say that she and I are high conflict. And I don't think either one of us would disagree with you on that. Speaking for myself, I'll let Tiana speak for herself. I am zero bullshit, zero fucks given 100% of the time. I don't tolerate crap from anyone. In fact, what infuriates me the most is when I see people try to take advantage of other people. I get a little mama bearish about that. She and I started talking about conflict and, and working at Amazon and how it was such a high conflict environment and how we had been called upon by our boss to be more high conflict, more aggressive in meetings, which was hysterical to us both. In fact, we laughed for a good minute and a half about that yesterday, and that we were both like, wait, what? You want us to take the gloves off? Oh, all right. You want full volume? Okie dokie. And I'm going to tell you that lasted about a week, if it lasted even that long, because Tiana and I are like, hey, we were keeping it under wraps. But at Amazon, the conflict was always about the problem and the customer. And that's why conflict came up as a conversation with her yesterday, and that how we were high conflict and would be in high conflict situations, high conflict arguments, high conflict meetings, like planned conflict almost. Like you would plan to go in and have a conflict. That sort of thing. You would build your armies before you went to the meeting. We politely call that pre-wiring. That's just building up the whose mafia is going to be involved. And so we were accustomed to this high conflict environment, and it didn't bother us. Part of it didn't bother us because we both kind of come from high conflict backgrounds, but it did this concept of conflict did not bother us. And I told her this story recently that I had this conversation with someone about, and this is why this all became something I wanted to talk about in a podcast. So we're meeting with a vendor. I'm in a consulting role here, new leader who I helped hire into the org. And the vendor presents a concept that this new leader is not familiar with. And so she has a reaction to it and like, no, that's not, that I've never seen that before. That doesn't exist. And I was like, well, we actually have seen these, or, I have seen them. Or I said we, because this particular client and I had actually seen these before. I was like, well, we have seen these before. It's not ideal, but, it is kind of the way the industry is moving. Now, as your supply chain consultant, I have some perspective here that is perhaps different and also perhaps wider than the perception and the experience of this new leader. Nevertheless, she doubled down and argued about it in front of the vendor. And as the advisor, right, I'm like, well, okay, I understand. And I kind of let it go. And then she didn't want me to speak for the rest of the meeting. She kept giving me the shh. And it's okay. I've been around, right? So this doesn't bother me. There was a time in my life where I probably would have, ran out of the meeting screaming, but I was like, okay, whatever. So we walk out of the meeting and she pulls me aside and she says, you were unprofessional. Now, if you've been listening to my podcast or you've worked with me in the past, I am not unprofessional. Very rarely have I been professional. I can be abrasive. I can be shocking. And I can say there's probably a handful of times I may have been unprofessional. Okay, maybe. Okay, yes, this was not one of them. And I was like, really? Unprofessional? Tell me more. Like, tell me, please. I would like to know where I've been unprofessional, because obviously that's not good. And she said, oh, you were unprofessional when you contradicted me. I'm giving you a pause because I want you to let that sleep in. You were unprofessional when you contradicted me. Let me tell you something. That is not the definition of unprofessional. In fact, if we really wanted to grind it down, she was the one being unprofessional because she was actually ignorant and she had doubled down on it. The concept did exist. It is actually the concept they ended up using. So who was unprofessional? And moreover, conflict, having a different point of view, having different knowledge, sharing that point of view and knowledge that may be different than your own is not in any circumstance, unless I did it butt-ass naked, running around with a flaming torch out my ass, was that unprofessional? In any situation, is that unprofessional? It may have been a conflict. It may have been abrasive. It may have been something she didn't really want to hear. It may have been a surprise, but it was not unprofessional. And so when I told the story to Tiana, one, again, we laughed. And just to give you an idea, Tiana and I were supposed to record a 20-minute episode. It took 2.5 hours. Okay, so we had a lot of catching up to do. So we laughed about this because of all of the situations we had been in where if this was the definition of unprofessional, I mean, we would probably be in some white-collar crime prison somewhere. We would have been so unprofessional. But it raised the issue of conflict. and having conflict and using conflict and being okay with conflict. And that above and beyond all, conflict is not unprofessional. You can be unprofessional and be the nicest freaking person ever. I've seen it. You can be a complete incompetent leader and be the nicest dude or dudette. So conflict is not about being unprofessional. So what is good conflict? Now there's bad conflict, but good conflict, and the conflict that Tiana and I have worked with, lived through, and experienced, and I'm not saying it wasn't stressful, it was very stressful. And conflict certainly isn't, if you can get things done in a low conflict way, I highly recommend it. But at Amazon at the time, everything was kind of done with conflict. But so there was good conflict. And the conflict she and I started talking about was this conflict about a solution for a problem. Good conflict is about problems, not people. When you start getting into this quote unquote unprofessional, that's not about problems. That's people's egos, right? And that's a conflict of ego. Actually, it's a clash of egos, is what that is. And that has nothing to do actually with a conflict of a problem. That has to do with personality and ego. So that story I told you about the woman who was upset because she was unfamiliar with a contract style, that was ego. That was not unprofessionalism. That was conflict driven by ego. And that's different. That's bad conflict. We're going to get to that in a minute. But good conflict is getting in a room and hashing it out to figure out the right solution for a problem, regardless of how people feel about it, their personal interest. What is the right solution for the problem? Even if it's not the right solution for you personally and or for your team. There have been many situations that especially running international supply chain worldwide, the times I felt powerless. Oh, many times when we're going to do this, but it's disadvantage to my team. It would be more work for my team, disadvantage for me, whatever it was. But ultimately, it was what was best for the company and best for the customer. And even though I stood and fought, eventually I had to agree and let it go because it was what was right for the customer. But those conflicts, and Tiana and I got to laughing about them because they were intense. Like in today's standards, that just shit would just straight up illegal. Like there would be HR like dropping out of the season on ropes, out of the ceiling on ropes. Like it would just be straight up. We would all just been wrapped and bubble wrapped and escorted out. It would not happen. But back then, when you were building the foundation of what will be the biggest e-commerce company in the world, you're scrapping every day. You're in there, you're duking it out for what you think is right. And you're making it happen. And the other thing about conflict, when conflict is done well, and you get into a room with the right people and you hash it out. And conflict does not always look at, and this is what I was talking about, nice versus not nice. Conflict does not always look like standing on the table, stomping your feet, or beating the desk with your fist, or throwing shit in a meeting. By the way, I've seen it all. Or even screaming and yelling profanities. As you know, I love my profanities. Big fan of profanities. And it is not about being disrespectful. So conflict is not about disrespect. That goes back in this bad category. But conflict does not always look like these big emotional, big feelings, outbursts. Sometimes conflict can be quiet and be constructive and more emotionally controlled. Hopefully that's what you get in high stress situations. Like I said, when you're building the foundation of the biggest e-commerce company in the world, you don't have energy for managing your emotions. You're just trying to get your freaking work done. And so there's not a lot of energy for emotional management. That's why we all ran around like fucking lunatics. But we got shit done. So conflict in solving a problem, and the reason conflict is good is that if you can get the right people in the room and you can grind it out in an hour, hour and a half, whatever the problem is, if you can really get in there. And the other portion of positive conflict is there's an element of vulnerability and open-mindedness when you're having this conflict. Like, I know that's crazy, but if you can think about like fighting and being open at the same time, that's kind of and I'm sure there's probably, actually, I don't know much. I know actually jack shit about martial arts and Tai Chi and any of that stuff. But I do believe there is a concept of being open and fluid that is also part of fighting. So if you can do that, and Amazon perfected this, you move fast because we've gotten in, we figured it out, we've come up with the solution, everybody has shared their point of view, we have ground down every possible solution, and we've come to the right one, and everybody in that room has felt heard, they have voiced themselves, and we have a solution, and we are moving forward. Never to be discussed again. That is the product of good conflict. To be able to go into a room and speak your truth, present your ideas, and then be open and strong enough to hear the other side and let somebody pull your shit apart. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a meeting and had a solution and everybody was like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. That's not going to work. This isn't going to work, blah, 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 blah. And for a very long time, internally, my reaction was to close up, right? And be like, oh, no, I know. But through years, I learned that a lot of times they had something better or they could add something to it to make it better. So that is good conflict. And sometimes that looks ugly. It's not always pretty. Don't throw shit. Please don't do that. I've been in those meetings. I had a big leader. We're not gonna talk about who it was. But we would just take all the hard objects off of the conference tables and leave like the soft erasers. That way people didn't get hurt so bad. But anyway, it was tough times. But that is good conflict. What is bad conflict? Bad conflict is that shit that happened after that meeting. Bad conflict is pulling me aside and telling me I was unprofessional. In fact, it was more unprofessional what she did and even more high conflict what she did. And the reason that was bad conflict is because it was personal. Yep. It was a personal conflict. There was a clash of egos. New leader wants to be the one in charge, wants to show everybody she's got it, maybe a little intimidated from the wizened consultant. And it was a clash of egos. And that is bad conflict because nothing good came out of that. In fact, I challenged her and said, look, just because we don't agree doesn't mean that I am being unprofessional. And of course, she doubled down because that's what you do. And this is how I left it. We're going to have to agree to disagree on this. And I walked away. Now, she about came unglued on that. And we're just going to leave it that she was pretty hot. Now, coming from the environment I came from, I just moved on, right? Had a drink and we disagree. That's it. It is okay to disagree. And I want to share this with the young managers and leaders coming up for you to accept this on both ends. And that it is okay to disagree. It is okay to disagree with your boss. And it is okay for your team to disagree with you. Because in disagreement, in conflict, like I talked about in the good conflict example, in the disagreement, in the conflict is where you find the magic, is where you find the solution, is where you find the answer. So when you shut down a new idea. Remember, I talk about open mind all the time, right? Leadership, open mind. The higher you go, the less you know. When you don't allow conflict, you don't allow a different point of view, you're shutting down new ideas, new solutions, and you're shutting down the creativity and growth of your team. How can they grow if they can't have new thoughts? How can they grow if they can't have new solutions? How can they grow if they can't think freely? And going up the ladder, if you can't respectfully disagree and have a conflict with your boss, how are you going to grow? How is he going to grow? Or she going to grow? How is your department going to grow? How are you going to find the right solutions? Now, all of this needs to be done respectfully. I want to reiterate that. I haven't always been respectful in my conflict. As I mentioned, at Amazon, we didn't have a lot of energy for emotional management. There were drugs for that. My PR team just lost it. They hate it when I talk about drugs. Anyway, there you go, babies. So conflict needs to be done respectfully, and good conflict is about the problem, the solution, and the customer. Bad conflict is a clash of egos and is about what I want, what I need, and what I'm afraid of. Mostly the last. What am I afraid of? We'll talk about fear too at some point in the future. Let me make a note. Because fear, my friends, is the root of all evil. Okay, so that's my talk about conflict today. Oh, I've gone over my 20 minutes. These things are getting longer. You know, I was really worried when I started that I would not even be able to finish 20 minutes, but it seems I got a lot to say. So, thank you. I appreciate you being here. I hope everything goes well for you today, and we'll talk tomorrow.